But no, Quadratus. As a career soldier, I can promise you that it is the unexpected factors in any campaign that spill our best laid plans as messily as an overturned cup of wine. My father used to advise me against worrying about what might happen, because he said what you worry about doesn't happen. It is the unborn thought that matures unseen and then very suddenly explodes before us. You failed to consider one element in this elaborate cabal, and that is the nature of the female you sent as a gift. I am certain that it never occurred to you that in order for her to please me sufficiently to lose my reason, then I must please her. A development I regret to report has not been accomplished. I suspect the trouble lies in your anxiety to launch her on this expedition without resorting to torture or threats of death, both of which you must have known would be the undoing of your final purpose. If you did not actually promise, then you at least suggested that if she obliged me, I would no doubt proclaim her free, and possibly the members of her family now accompanying her. This is the treaty she is really after, and she will think of nothing else until it is agreed. In some ways, it is a pity you cannot be here to witness her tender regard for me. He pressed his hand against her cheek and called her name. Shiva, the morning is here. She groaned, then opened her eyes and stared at him as if he were a total stranger. Can I go now? Her voice was flat. No, I have been thinking about you, which is amusing, and these days, with your insane compatriots perched above my head like so many defeating pigeons, I find too little cause for laughter. They are not my compatriots. I have told you 100 times I am not a native of this God-forsaken land. How you blaspheme the soil of your perpetually invisible God is said to prefer. If you were a proper Jew, your home would be anywhere. Sometimes I think we have more Jews living in Rome than Romans. She started to rise, but he caught her arm and pulled her down to the couch again. I have a notion to have another go at you. He spoke more in jest than intent, yet he was vaguely disappointed that his words caused her to twist quickly from his grasp. After she had broken away, she stood looking down at him, and he could find no hint of encouragement in her eyes. Suddenly he reached down, pulled back the silken coverlet, and seized his penis. Here is one power even General Silva does not have, she sneered. Behold the glory of Rome reduced to a worm. For a moment not a sound passed between them. An instant flush of rage sent the blood stinging through his body. Then, as suddenly as her hand had closed upon him, he became limp. He put back his head and began to chuckle softly. Alas, Shiva, you speak the truth. When she released him, he looked down at his nakedness and grunted. But if you ever try that again, I recommend you be more gentle. Otherwise, I shall most certainly have you crucified. She shrugged her shoulders and stepped up to the opposite side of the tent. There she raised her arms and slipped into a heavily embroidered linen robe. What a pity, he thought. Now that amber skin is hidden again. As she tied her sandals, she spoke angrily in Greek. I was promised that if I did not resist your loathsome paws and jaws, if I tolerated contact with your reptilian skin, then I would be free. Who made such promises? You. Nonsense. I had a little wine, but I never lost my balance, mental or otherwise. He pushed himself to a sitting position and instantly found that his head was like a great marble stone. He decided that he knew why statues carved so that they appeared to be holding up the roof of a temple were always bent forward. He had indeed drunk a great deal of wine. It was happening too often, and he must stop it. If Vespasian knew a man was seriously courting the grape, he was soon relieved, and sooner or later Vespasian knew everything. Holding his forehead, he said, "I think you poisoned me last night. My God, who is the one and only God, blessed me with leprosy and instructed me to share it with you?" Slowly and very cautiously he stretched his arms and legs. He took his time. Then he yawned. "If that be true, I know of a certain Greek surgeon attached to the 10th Legion, who for the carelessness of his examination will be impaled butt up on a rusty javelin." He groaned and added, "Come rub the back of my neck." He was mildly surprised that she obeyed without hesitation. That was the spell of this female. She had so many inherent surprises. You kept wanting to see what happened next. He noticed that she manipulated her fingers in such a way that their movements could not possibly be mistaken for caresses, but the effect was still soothing, so he twisted his head far enough around to smile at her. "I have wasted some time this morning trying to decide what it is about you that intrigues me. I finally decided I have been so long in this noxious land that I can no longer differentiate between a she-goat and a woman. I even wondered if it could be that when I lie with you, my normally discriminating penis discovers something rare. Or is it that he has lost communication with my brain and neither cares what the other does? Perhaps it's the way I smell. All Jews stink, do they not, great Caesar? Oh, come now, let us not spoil these intriguing excursions by preoccupation with facts. I prefer to ignore your unfortunate ancestry." He noticed that her moving fingers had not lost a beat. They could have been talking about the weather. "I must therefore be certain to maintain my own composure as well, no matter what the provocation," he thought. "The game is amusing because my opponent is alert to my every weakness and thus forces me to remain on the defensive. Even so, she cannot possibly win unless I permit her to rattle me, in which event I might do or say something very foolish. If once I allow her to wheedle through my defense, then that will be the beginning of the end. It is I who will be made captive. And what is more rare than a truly merciful female?" For a time they were silent, and Silva listened to the grinding hum that never ceased outside his tent. It was like living in the center of a rock quarry, he thought, yet it was a great deal more endurable than if the sound stopped, which could only mean something was wrong with the great work at hand, a military engineering feat all men on earth, foe or friend, must soon admire. Or he had often considered laugh at Flavius Silva's great ramp. "Ho, ho! Dare give the man 6 cubits on his chains and no more, and do not forget to remove his teeth lest he bite his keeper. Can't you see he is insane?" It was unfortunate that Vespasian had never seen Masada. Then he might better understand how its conquest could not be simply a matter of attack in force. If Vespasian were here, he could only agree that the Jews on top were maniacs, and he could also hear them declare themselves as to how they would not come down from Masada at any persuasion, and how all Romans were the obvious result of mass fornication between baboons and hyenas. What a satisfaction it would be to point at the summit of the rock after the Jews had dumped their daily quota of insults and say to Vespasian, "As you may easily observe, sire, there is no way to scale the heights unless you are a lizard. Therefore, we must bring these heights down to our level," which means moving a good part of that mountain to the mountain, which is, of course, expensive. But when the ramp is finished, you can see how we will move our machines up the ramp, break through the wall, and finish this very last nuisance in Judea. And of course Vespasian would smile approvingly and announce loudly enough for all his staff to hear that Flavius Silva had created something of a military marvel, which after all one might expect from a genius. He would not so speak unless there had been a vast change in his philosophy since last seen. When was it? On the very day he had announced the construction of a forum? The most parsimonious Roman in history could complain bitterly of the expense involved in building an absolutely necessary military tool, and demand to know why the job couldn't be done with 100 donkeys instead of 500. And if the ramp proved a failure, for a certainty, General Flavius Silva would soon find himself a procurator of the 5% tax on inheritances somewhere in the frozen wilds of Britannia at best. Listening, Silva tried to separate the grinding sounds of great stones being moved from the constant echoes of great stones being moved from the constant echoes and reverberations of pick and hammer, the squeal of sledges and the snapping of whips. There were counterpoint cries of pain and anger, the honk of pigs and the bray of donkeys from outside the camp wall, and the occasional shouts of complaint and derision of his soldiers. All this in the middle of a desert wilderness. All this, he thought, for less than 1,000 stubborn Jews. He listened for a shout from the heights, but all sound from above seemed to be lost in the general bedlam. He tipped back his head and sighed. "Bacchus has covered my tongue with fungus. I will not touch another drop of wine until your friends up there surrender." Her fingers did not pause as she answered, "Congratulations, you have just ordered yourself to abstain forever. The ramp will be finished soon. The grapes can wait so long." "Oh," she said contemptuously, although her fingers continued rhythmically, "you haven't the will." Now the fingers stopped and she moved around to face him. "Now what about your promise? You said I would be free. You said no harm will come to me unless I commit a civil crime. Those were your own words, great and benign governor of Judea." "Then I was drunk." "So? It is as I thought." She stood before him, her eyes unwavering. He looked away. Vaguely now, he did recall some discussion about her status, but when wine commanded, who was not inclined to become overly sympathetic to the woes of others. Yes, once in Gaul he had presented a fine horse to a passing beggar simply because the man's feet were bare and it was snowing, and because in the fort he had just left, which was near Cardoni, he had drunk a skinful. Ah, my dear poor brain, It is so mired in remorse it can only cope with the most routine matters this morning. It tells me I must smell like a camel, and the sooner I refresh with a bath, the better. It also tells me this Shiva has me pinned to something I said when out of my wits. What is as you thought? He asked. He looked up to meet her searching eyes and found it so uncomfortable that he looked above her head and studied the crescent of light. What did you think? Come tell me what is gnawing at you. I am in good temper. I've been thinking that your word is as weak as your will and your loins, she said flatly. He rose quickly and, flinging back his arm, struck her across the mouth. The blow propelled her far from the couch and brought blood to her lips. His voice rang out so hysterically when he called for the guard, he could not believe it was his own. When they appeared, he waited for his heavy breathing to subside. Take this female, he began. Take her and do what? How could this little slut be best repaid? I must show her the mercy of wine is not a permanent affliction, and I must show myself now, before it is forever too late, that I can be rid of her. From now on, he resolved, he would treat all Jews, as a treacherous race of barbarians. Furthermore, he would not touch so much as a drop of wine until he was relieved in Judea and was safely established in the new house near Praeneste. And he would most of all not waste any more of his precious time on this vindictive little animal or her relatives. He deliberately kept his voice soft and controlled when he motioned to the guards. Take this woman to the centurion Rosianus Geminus. Say that I wish her given her freedom. He will release her in the camp of the third cohort to run at will. After he has called for 50 volunteers to achieve the following reward. The first man to catch her and mount her will receive 50 shekels. Once he has done, she is to be free again, so that our second man may win 49 shekels. The last man, who I doubt need be very fleet of foot, perhaps old Gallienus, who was somewhat crippled in Macedonia, might be the final one to pin her down, will receive 1 shekel. He inclined his head slightly toward her and thought, at last I have seen dread in Shiva's eyes. By that time, 1 shekel is about what she will be worth. He was determined to appear indifferent as the guards took her arms and urged her towards the exit. Paternus and Severns, peasant lads from Spain, very strong and not very bright, he thought. Look at them, Shiva. Can't you see from their stone faces that the best of your wiles will not alter their orders? Can't you see they are iron men with iron heads, and unless you have the good sense to beg my mercy, they will indeed take you to the camp of the third cohort. Can't you see, little Jewess, that I am a very lonely man, and can't you remember how only a short time ago we were locked in such pleasure, and perhaps could there not be even more for both of us given time and understanding? Would it astound you to know, little Jewess, that I too am frightened of what might become of me, and that I need you? He searched her face for the slightest hint of compromise, and finding none, halted the guards with his raised hand. Shiva, do you understand you can never return? Do you understand what will happen to you? She stared at him in exactly the same way she had from the courtyard in Jericho. "Yes," she said quietly, "and I understand the word of a noble Roman general. Like all other Romans, you speak with your mouth and promise with your anus." She cleared her throat carefully and spat directly into his face. Part 2. Later, General Flavius Silva sat in his oval-shaped campaign bath, which was of bronze and lavishly ornamented at both ends with ram's heads. It had been given to him by his godfather, Sejanus Piso, a name revered in Roman military society, and the occasion had been Silva's original assignment as a tribune with the 7th Legion in Dalmatia. He had not then intended to serve more than the customary 6 months, after which he would strive for a senatorial career. Alas, he thought, such a divergence was now highly unlikely. I may be a procurator newly appointed, but for more than 15 years I have been the world's most dedicated procrastinator. Witness how I have contrived to postpone every separation from the army, using the limp excuse that it was in its way its own guarantee of the gods' favor. The same life, the same bath, the same sword and personal equipage through all of my travels and wars. Regard this tub. It has become a reflection of myself, a much-used thing, prematurely aged, quite unnaturally beaten and dented, and scarred in performance of its duty. There, at the foot, is a crumpling left as a memorial of that clumsy donkey responsible for its transport across Macedonia. The beast fell over a cliff, and it took half a cohort of men to retrieve the tub. Yes, as am I, dilapidated. So many dents and scratches acquired, banging around on camels in Africa, horses in Aquitania, barges, sleds, hunquirmes, pykes, and the backs of slaves in Thrace, Dalmatia, Britannia, and Lusitania. Silva wondered idly if he should give the tub a rank and medal for service and perhaps promote it once a year. He looked down at his body. It matched the bath all too well, even to the bronzing provided by the Judean sun. There was the molded crater in his right thigh, the souvenir of a Thracian javelin, which the surgeon, a rather clever Greek, had thought better to dig out rather than pull through. The fellow had first soaked a sponge in mandragora juice, then placed it in your mouth. As he had predicted, the juice slipped down to your digestive tract, and its soporific effect, at least partially, eased the pain when he cut away and tied off the blood vessels and finally cauterized their orifices with a hot iron. The result was a well-healed blemish, now sharing an originally well-formed body with a rather full complement of others. I had better do all I can to sharpen my wit, he said to Epos, his Numidian, because this over-abused carcass is becoming a thing of very little value. It pleased him to make a confidant of the Numidian, since the man was deaf and dumb, yet not as a consequence of nature, which would have left him merely another uninteresting slave. His former master had been a magistrate and tax farmer in Cyprus, and it seemed Epos had observed him seduce a Cypriot boy, and had been so unwise as to confirm the fact when the consul's hopelessly narrow-minded wife began to ask questions. While it was intriguing to reflect on what might have been Epos's fate had he refused to testify before the wife, the magistrate's fury was forever recorded, determined that Epos was pass on no more gossip concerning himself or anyone else. He had ordered his eardrums destroyed with repeated and prolonged head-slapping, and then had one half of his tongue removed. Soon after, the jealous wife killed the magistrate over a subsequent affair, again with a boy, and eventually Epos was, as part of the estate, was sent off to the Antioch market where Silva had bought him. And why not? He was a bargain at a mere 1,000 sesterces, hardly a week's salary for the procurator. Few people wanted a mute hovering about, but for a general of the legions who must have his own secrets, how could there be a better attendant? As Epos oiled his body, Silva wryly inspected his own powerful chest, noting with pleasure the absence of fat about his middle, and with casual regret his legs, which were much too long for the bath. The right leg, with its scar of Thracian revenge, was muscular, and as fine a limb as ever, but the left, without a scratch on it, was now almost a third less in diameter and visibly shorter by almost 2 inches. Procrastination again during the attack on Jerusalem. Sextus Cerilius, commander of the 5th Legion, had maneuvered himself into a tight spot. He should have known better than to arrange a parley with the Jews. The dunce had convinced himself that for a few thousand shekels he would be told of some easy entrance to the city. He had agreed to take only 4 men as escort, and of course was ambushed. Cerilius, who was a much better politician than a soldier, would never have orated again if you had not chanced along the same gully with a troop of horses. The Jews fled, and you swung down from your horse, very much the haughty fellow. Too quickly. Instead of Cerilius's thanks, you soon received his sympathy, for in your hasty dismounting you had landed on a rock instead of solid earth, sprawled face down in the dust in the most undignified manner, and somehow managed to part most of your Achilles tendon. The pain was endurable when diluted with wine, so it had been nearly a week before you had summoned the Greek surgeons. They had contrived poultices of elaterium without favorable results, so they had filled you with poppy tear pills, and once again they had cut and tied. They said the leg would always be short, and you would limp forever. A gimpy old man at 37. Zeus! You could not catch a turtle. As a final and bitter reminder of the event, Cerilius had managed to have his cipher of a son assigned to your staff. Now there was a lad to make a man grateful he had remained childless. The warmth of the bath and the oiling of his body eased Silva's wine depression, yet he found it impossible to avoid brooding about the Jewess. "I have marched across the world," he said to Epos, "and never have I known such aggravation with a female." Moments after Sheva had been taken from his tent, he had bellowed for Attius, his aide, and dispatched him to the camp of the third cohort with a new order, a counter-order to my original order. Epos. Confusion at headquarters, counter-order, my counter-order. Another way of confessing, I want to stall until I can think of something else. Master procrastinator that I am, she is now back in her comfortable tent enjoying a morning laugh with her conniving relatives. When the Numidian began to scrape the oil from his back and arms with a bronze stringel, Silva warned him to be gentle, and even though he knew he would not be heard, "I am in a delicate condition this morning, and the coming heat is going to make me whimper." The anticipation of yet another day in the desert suddenly seemed to multiply his loneliness, so that even the rumble of his own voice became reassuring. When I was a young boy, Epos, a Greek nurse bathed me, and I can remember her taking an extra long time to wash my jewels. I could not understand why she would be grinning all the time she was at it, until one day I found out the pleasant way, and I've been trying to find a home for my staff ever since. He splashed his hands in the tepid water, and studying them said, "If I have one claim to fame, Epos, it is that there is not a single ring on my fingers. I believe I am the only Roman in the world who refuses to wear one or a dozen. My wife Livia, whom I loved more than my very breath, brought me all sorts of rings, and I refused to wear them. After she perished, I took a concubine who vowed she would not be seen in public with me unless I wore at least 2 rings. And I refused. It was the same with playing the flute. Both my Livia and the concubine insisted I tootle away before it was the thing being done, and nothing I could say would convince them that I had no ear for music. Once, to please the concubine, I did pack a flute to Lustania, intending to practice, but after 10 minutes, insult to the instrument, I knew I had been right in the first place, so I threw it in the Tagus. When I returned after a year and a half, my concubine asked me to blow her tune, and I said, "Would you rather have a tune or a romp on the couch with me?" She said she would rather have a tune first, so I handed her an ivory phallus I had bought in a market in Valentia, and told her to go play a tune for herself, and that was the last I ever saw of her. While the Numidian massaged the remaining film of oil into his shoulders, Silva had tried dutifully to exercise the lid of his left eye, which drooped until the eyeball itself was barely visible. The deep cut extending from his chin diagonally across his lips and terminating at the helmet line had severed the orbicularis muscle. With exercise, the surgeons had promised he might someday regain use of the lid. Nonsense. 6 years had gone by since that Gallic brute had left his mark, and if anything, the lid was drooping ever lower. Well enough. At least if it closed completely, sleep would come easier. Quite a story about my fluting, is it not, Epos? But somewhat afar from the truth. I invented it to cover my real trouble, for I did not present the phallus to my concubine with any such carefree dash. I sent it to her by messenger, who also carried my deep apologies. She was a woman of great humor, and I hoped the symbol would cause her at least to smile, if and when she ever thought of me again. I hoped by bringing mirth to her lips that admirable woman would forgive my total failure to successfully consummate our partnership even so much as once. Give me credit for trying, Epos, as indeed I tried later with so many others. Believe me, Epos, I called upon every god to help me, and I called in every quack, every priest I could find, every sorcerer and advisor. In the way of aphrodisiacs, I tried hot and cold mud baths. I drank the urine of a bull, mixed according to a secret formula with goat hooves crushed at dawn. I ran around the Circus Maximus at midnight, starting once on my left foot and once on my right. I dipped my thumbs into the springs of Clitumnus, kissed the snout of a boar, drank a daily portion of egg whites, cinnamon, and hot mead until I retched at the thought of another, and I made a special pilgrimage to the Alps so I could stand naked before the summer thunderbolts. I hired harlots and their pimps to perform for me, while with another more than willing partner I worked up the most awesome sweats attempting to duplicate their feats. And all, Epos, was a failure. No sensation, visual or auditory, no touch or odor could erect my standard. For reasons I cannot comprehend, he has absolutely refused to stand duty since the loss of my wife. And that was a long time ago, Epos. Too long there have been periods when I thought I should lose my reason because of it. Times of such despair I seriously considered cutting my veins. This Jewess has made him stand again. She has but to pass through my line of vision, and I feel the blood coursing towards my formerly retired friend. He pulsates as if he were a youth. He stands again as my spear. What should I do, Epos? Is this Jewess the only woman in the world of appeal to him, or has there been some internal change which would not enable me to satisfy any woman? Should I keep the Jewess or send her on her way? Should I test him against another female? I'm afraid of that. Supposing I should fail. Epos, what shall I do with this Jewess who hates me? Silva bent forward and arched his shoulders so the Numidian could better scrape down his back. How he longed for a real Roman bath, with its laconicum to draw the soreness from his muscles, and the tepidarium where he could meet with other men like Status and discuss how the empire was being ruined by sycophants, fools, and opportunists. They must agree that the youth of Rome had grown soft and inexcusably spoiled, the doing of overindulgent Roman mothers who owned an alarming proportion of the national wealth. Epos, my silent friend, can you imagine that it used to be against the law to leave any part of your estate to a woman if it amounted to over 100,000 sesterces? But they got around that by persuading their husbands to leave it to a friend who had guaranteed to pass it on to the wife, so that now they own a part or all of everything in sight, and Vespasian will have to do something about it, or will all soon be their slaves. Silva pushed himself to his feet so the Numidian could scrape his legs, and while he waited he thought how much better he would feel if he could take this wine of remorse through the frigidarium, shouting and slapping his backsides as the steam rose from his body. I am out of touch, he thought, out of touch with Rome, which means out of touch with life. With the imperial post taking from 30 to 50 days, how could anyone even hope to sense the trends in the capital of the world? I drown myself in wine because I have no other friend, no person on this earth who will take care of my troubles, nor seek me out for myself. And furthermore, he said aloud, as he stepped from his bath, I, Flavius Silva, am sick of Flavius Silva and his endless sorrows for himself. Epus held a mirror before Silva while he carelessly shoved at the curls about his head. Balding, he murmured, and the rest might do for an actor's mask, providing he must represent a long-neglected jar of wine pickled in the sun and torn by the winds, and badly cracked down one side. He passed a finger along the deep scar left by the Gaul. You are exceptionally pretty this morning, he said to the mirror. Who else bears a cut that changes with the color of last night's wine? Silva preferred to shave himself, and when he had finished, he brushed his teeth with a powdered mixture of calcined bones, oyster shells, and a scrupulum of nitre, which was said to be an aid towards strengthening the gums. He reached out for his short pantaloons, which the Numidian held out to him, and when he had pulled them on, he sat on a chest so Epos could tie his sandals, which were of chamois and adorned with a miniature fox's head at the upper limit of the lacings, but hobnailed along the sole in the same style as any legionaries. Epos held a tunic before him with the bottom end open. He dived into it, and when his head emerged through the neck, he was astonished to see a stranger standing just inside the tent's entrance. No, he thought, he is not a stranger at all. Beneath that ridiculous get-up was Pomponius Falco, the one man in the great city of Rome. Silva decided instantly whom he was least interested in seeing. And with him, of course, standing shyly just inside the entrance, was one of his pretty boys. By the gods, Falco, how did you get here? A most arduous journey, I assure you, dear fellow, and after such effort, I have rather expected a warmer welcome. He touched the hand of the youth beside him. I present Cornelius Tertullus, also formerly of Ravenna. I am not particularly honored, Silver said, ignoring the youth. He was watching Falco's cruel eyes dart about the tent, and he knew they would be inquiring into every detail of his personal life. The scoundrel was wearing a wig or had his hair curled. It mattered not which, and he reeked of nard and perfume as always. His fingers were cluttered with rings, and Silva now remembered his very bad complexion. Instead of treating it with gals or whorehound or bitter vetch in the normal manner of those so afflicted, Pomponius Falco was known to travel with a herd of asses so he could make a dough of their milk and smear his face with it before he retired. How cheering it was now to observe how the ceremony had not remedied his appearance in the slightest. But careful! Whatever the stories about Pomponius Falco, and however much the urge to express your loathing, it is best to bear in mind that he can be an exceedingly dangerous man. He has an accountant's mind and a nearly incredible memory for people's affairs, gossip, and deeds. A very feminine mind, Silva thought. He was one of those quick and shrewd men who these days so infested the capital.